Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're super excited to have Alex Aronson with us here today from Court Accountability. You guys know the drill. I'm going to read the bio, and then we're going to get right into the questions. Alex Aronson is Court Accountability's co-founder and executive director. Alex's work on constitutional politics, dark money, and judicial accountability has helped elevate these issues to national prominence, informing headlines and driving congressional action. Alex has served as chief counsel and senior counsel to U.S. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, managing director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown University Law Center, an attorney in the appellate section of the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, a litigation associate at Covington and Burling LLP, and a law clerk to Judge Albert Diaz on the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. Alex's commentary has appeared in outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, The Hill, Rolling Stone, The Guardian, and Courier, and he regularly appears on national television programs and high-profile podcasts, including hosting a regular webcast on Midas Touch's Legal AF channel. Alex, it's terrific to see you again. For our listeners, you'll probably remember that a few weeks ago, I had the honor of speaking with Alex about Begins With Us, women's advocacy, and many issues affecting our generation. Alex, it's nice to have the tables turned, so to speak. Welcome. We're so glad to have you here.
Man, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So first, I wanted to kind of jump in with your career in the law. You've worked in the government as a law clerk and on the very influential Senate Judiciary Committee, and you've worked in the Justice Department, but you've also worked in advocacy at Georgetown Law and are now focused on court accountability. Could you share with us why you made these pivots? Were they driven by the times, by an event, or just by a natural desire to try new areas of the law, or perhaps all of the above?
Or maybe just this guy can't keep a job. No, it's my career has been sort of like organically sort of wending its way toward where I find myself now in some interesting ways. I guess I was like a lot of kids that get out of college and don't quite know what to do with themselves. I worked for a few years after college, did some really, really meaningful work. I was a youth organizer doing political organizing work, nonpartisan work, trying to increase voter participation and to through policy work trying to break down obstacles to young voter and marginalized voter participation. And immediately, as an organizer in that context, I started to run into all sorts of obstacles that probably should have surprised me more than they did. But, folks, making arguments against common sense ideas like having better access to voter registration or automatic voter registration, things that increase people's ability to participate in the franchise. And as a young organizer, I was in my early 20s, we were getting opposition, people saying there was voter fraud and concerns about election integrity that needed, that justified a blocking those types of reforms. And so I went into law and I went to law school because I thought that it would be an avenue through which I could sort of grapple with those types of objections. It was kind of a vague sense that I could achieve justice and do good work for the world using the tools that law provided. And then, my career, all of the different stops you sort of mentioned were me sort of just trying to figure out how to do that. I had some time in private practice, learning kind of how big law works and representing big corporate clients. I moved to the Justice Department, where I sort of got to do my dream job of being an appellate litigator for the Civil Rights Division, with that division's incredible legacy and history. And then it was actually there, working in the Justice Department, where I got up close and personal kind of experience seeing the ways in which our institutions, even before Trump was president, were really not serving the American people, and the extent to which impediments within the law were keeping us collectively as a population, as a people, from being able to achieve some of the things that so many of us want, and that, again, that aren't sort of like partisan political issues, but are just the way that most Americans want the world to work. That because of the way that our institutions have been weakened and compromised and corrupted, we're not getting done. And so that really helped me embark on the later stage of my advocacy career.
I'd like to ask you now about your current stop, Court Accountability. Would you mind sharing with our listeners why you founded this organization, what its mission is, what you guys are working on, and your areas of focus towards the end of this year and then looking forward to 2026?
Yeah, thanks. Court Accountability, we founded in June of 2023, so we're just about 2 years old now. And it was after my time working at Georgetown Law School. I was involved as a managing director with an incredible litigating organization there called the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection. And I found my way there after spending 5 years, as you mentioned, working in the United States Senate, where I worked on judicial confirmation issues on politics and oversight, vetting nominations. I worked on Supreme Court nominations. I left that experience, the sort of the the 1-2 punch of those two experiences, working with some of the very best litigators in the game and working with the top Democrats on the Senate Judiciary Committee, this all important committee for the handling of our nation's laws and the ongoings of the federal judiciary and the Justice Department, deeply alarmed that the pro-democracy community, and that's a big tent, right? That's the I think you can include most of the media in that the Democratic Party, the legal profession broadly, had underestimated what had happened during the first Trump years when it came to the court and what had happened with the courts. And specifically, I'm talking about the confirmation of over 200 judges who were selected by hand by outside special interest groups, in our view, in our diagnosis, to steadily advance a deeply unpopular agenda, which has multiple components. It has a kind of a pro-billionaire anti-regulatory component, industry interests that don't want to be regulated by the government. It has some theocratic components, white Christian nationalist ideology starting to infuse itself into the laws of the United States through the judges that this network was putting onto the courts, bringing us rulings like Dobbs and the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And of course, the historic antipathy of the Lost Cause Coalition, from the Civil War, from the unresolved conflict that our country has over slavery and its legacy. And so from those sort of strains of ideological conviction, what we were seeing was the advance of a political agenda through the courts, uh, and concurrent diminution of democratic access by those same judges. Specifically, I mean the elimination or the weakening of important ways for people to see their will reflected in government, whether through voting or through limitations that bipartisan Congresses had passed on money in politics. What we saw was a systemic erosion of democratic access to government. And I thought that what we needed was to confront this machinery, the machinery of money and political ideology that had infected our courts and was using the goodwill of the federal judiciary, the reputation that it had built up over the centuries, rightly or wrongly, we could talk about, as a protector of rights and freedoms, as a protector of the marginalized and the vulnerable, uh, as a fair and neutral arbiter of law. That was gone. And so then what were we going to do if we wanted to have a democracy after this period with the Supreme Court and its composition durably set in time, right? These are young justices that comprise most of this Republican Supreme Court majority. They are going to be in control of that court for a long time. So how do we grapple with that? And so, to fill the need, I thought, for more sustained, more focused, more forward-leaning advocacy on these issues, we launched Court Accountability. And we do a whole bunch of stuff to try to bring these issues to the forefront, to expose what's happening behind the scenes at the courts, and to help Americans understand the extent to which their lives are affected by the everyday comings and goings of the federal courts and what they're doing to us.
Staying on the topic of justices and judges really quickly, I want to switch over to judicial accountability. As you said, we have these 200 new judges, and this is an ever-pressing issue. And one of the most pressing topics, especially in 23 and 24, was judicial ethics, the transparency or lack thereof, and the information that the public had about the financial interests and professional interactions of the Supreme Court justices. From your standpoint, now that some time has passed and it seems like there are now so many other front burner issues, what was happening then? Did the topic of an enforceable ethics code get resolved as it should be? And why should this issue matter to the public still today?
Oh, our short attention span information economy seems like a million years ago that everybody was deeply alarmed and concerned about rampant corruption at the Supreme Court. It was really, I think there's no other way to put it. Those stories that came out starting in the spring of 23 and continuing into 2024, together they comprise the biggest judicial corruption scandal in United States history, right? We had billionaires with interests before this court, whether they had specific cases or broader interests, because of course the decisions of the Supreme Court have effects and consequences that extend far beyond the parties to a given lawsuit, right? These billionaires had real financial stakes in the issues that the court was deciding, and they were secretly and in violation of federal disclosure laws, not informal ethics requirements, but real laws. They were not disclosed these trips, and we had a lot of fights about what disclosures were required and whether there were legal violations or not. But the upshot, of course, was that nobody was held to account. There were some really important dynamics that started to, I think, get unpacked through the course of those fights. One was that we have a two-tiered system of ethics and accountability within the federal courts. We've got the Supreme Court and everybody else. The lower federal court judges are bound by an enforceable ethics code that the courts that Article 3, the federal court system, maintains and enforces. There's a committee that reviews complaints that are leveled against judges and adjudicates them. They can be disciplined and sanctioned, even though they maintain life tenure and can only be removed through the impeachment process in Congress. But the Supreme Court has asserted and continues to assert that it cannot be subject to any enforceable ethics requirements or ethics code, that because the Supreme Court justices are superior officers to the inferior judges that make up that judicial conference that would likely make up the committee of judges to review complaints that theoretically might be lodged against Supreme Court justices, that they cannot be bound by any enforcement regime that anybody comes up with. They also insist that they are beyond the reach of Congress. This raises serious separation of powers concerns, right? They say, we're a separate branch of government. You can't do oversight about what we're doing. You can't ask us questions. We don't have to answer you. What they're doing is claiming for themselves unilaterally a constitutional immunity that doesn't have any basis in the text, history, or tradition of the Constitution that these same justices love to tout as their guiding star for constitutional interpretation. And on the other side of that ledger, what we saw was a Congress that was far too supine in allowing the court to get away with those arguments, right? And what we saw was the biggest judicial corruption crisis in United States history, and Democrats in Congress who had they had all the power, right? Dick Durbin had the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Democrats controlled the House. Joe Biden was the president. They could have pursued serious and rigorous oversight. They could have issued subpoenas. They could have called fact witnesses to testify at hearings. They didn't want this fight. They didn't want to provoke a fight. And it's a big and complicated conversation about why they didn't. But the very undesirable and very consequential effect of that strategic decision not to have that fight is that they have effectively ceded Congress's power to conduct real oversight of the judiciary. We should have that fight again. We should not give up on it. But that's the upshot here, is that the court got caught. These justices got caught breaking not only the court's own ethics rules, but federal statutes around gift disclosure and recusal. People tried to hold them to account. The press and the public were outraged, and the Congress couldn't find the will, couldn't find the vision to deliver meaningful accountability or reform to address it. And so it in some very important ways led us to the very woeful state of affairs that we find ourselves in now, where Article 1 in the Congress, controlled now with a Republican trifecta is completely in the thrall of Trump, and in the context of judicial confirmation fights we're having in the moment is continuing this trend of a ceding power to both the executive branch and to the courts.
Thank you for sharing that. And kind of along the same lines, I'd like to tag on a question about dark money. You've written and spoken extensively on the issue of dark money, not only when it comes to influences on the judiciary, but in the context of federal elections and Congress. Could you put this topic into a broader context? What's going on here? Do you see a path in this political climate for further reform? And if not, then are we essentially stuck where we are?
Dark money is a huge problem. It's hard to pick any one issue in our politics as sort of like the meta issue, resolution of which would clear the field for bipartisanship and comity and progress once more. And I think it's people are a little too reductionist. But if there is one, it could be this one. It's money in politics and the related issue of dark money in politics. And it goes back, of course, to this billionaire scheme to control the Supreme Court, rewrite the Constitution, and lock the people out of power. It doesn't take much to add up how you can destroy a democracy by buying it, right? And we've seen since the court's decision in 2010's Citizens United, which struck down Congress's bipartisan money in politics legislation, the BICRA, the bipartisan campaign Finance Reform Act. I don't know. It's getting squished up. But that banned or that limited independent expenditures on electoral races, right? And the court said that these independent expenditures could not be corrupting of our political system because we would have disclosure, we would know who's behind it, and there wouldn't be coordination allowed between the independent expenditure organizations like Citizens United, the group in that case, and the candidates. Now, a decade and a half later, what we've seen is federal election spending, including most notably independent election spending, just absolutely skyrocketing. I mean, you should look at the graph chart. It's just like, boom, it's like straight up. And then we've seen anecdotally how it does corrupt, right? We've seen what happens when somebody like Elon Musk drops nearly $300 million on an election and then is effectively handed the reins of the federal government. I mean, the reasoning of Citizens United has been destroyed by the facts on the ground. They were false at the time, and they've been proven false time and time again since that decision was handed down. It didn't actually speak, that decision, to dark money. Dark money is political money, or money that is infused into, often it's in the nonprofit system that isn't supposed to be political, but is effectively acting in politics without disclosure of the source of the funding. And what's happened since Citizens United, although that case doesn't speak to it, is that dark money has proliferated, largely through different nonprofit vehicles like the 501c3, the charitable, tax-deductible vehicles. There's a little more transparency there, but also in these 501c4 organizations called social welfare organizations that are allowed to do up to 50% of their work in the realm of politics. That means they can engage on campaigns, endorse candidates without having to disclose where that money's coming from. And one of my deep concerns about the state of our democracy is that dark money is festering throughout it. It's not a partisan problem. It's across the partisan divide. Both parties find themselves incredibly dependent on unlimited cash support from corporate interests and the ultra wealthy. And so when you have a system that exists that way, like, who do you think that the government's going to serve? And I think this, frankly, it was Charles Koch and the right-wing mega donors that funded the Citizens United approach to the Supreme Court, that worked to constitutionalize this status quo. And it's less, I think their strategy was less necessarily to be able to fund ad nauseum their preferred Republican candidates that they could count on to do the things that they wanted, and mostly that anti-regulatory pro-corporate agenda, but also to, and perhaps most importantly, to capture and trap Democrats who were working to regulate them from being able to do things that impact or constrain corporate externalities, right? Because at the end of the day, if a Democrat wants to, they might talk a big game and say they're going to represent the people, but at the end of the day, if the candidate knows that dark money can show up, even just the threat of unlimited expenditures on their race that could wipe them out of their seat, there's only so far they can go to represent the people. And so dark money to me, is really the rot at the center of a metastasizing. Now I'm really mixing metaphors. It's really bad, but a deeply rotting political system that was meant to be broken by the special interests that now are exploiting that broken system for their own financial ends.
I appreciate you sharing both sides of that coin from a corporate viewpoint, but also individuals. I'd love to zoom in on Elon Musk. And just recently, we saw Elon Musk announce his intent to form a new political party and perhaps a movement to countervail the Republican and Democratic parties when he doesn't agree with the direction that he wants our country to go in, from the standpoint of accountability, but also from the long held aspiration of one person, one vote. What are the concerns here? How do we get to this point? And perhaps more importantly, how do we return to a system of equal access and fair representation?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I think it'd be useful to disaggregate the question of accountability for Elon Musk's kind of corrupt takeover of the federal government. And obviously, we're talking now, it's July 8th, and he's in the middle of this kind of month-long now feud with Trump. And we'll see, how much relevance he has going forward within the MAGA coalition. I do think there's real it's a really important conversation to have about whether the two-party system is serving the country. And I think because of the extent to which money has captured our political system, the two-party system has not been able to handle handle this breakdown in a way that you would hope it could. And I think it's been the breakdown and the polarization that we've seen because of the two-party system has been worsened by effectively what we're dealing with now in terms of our information environment, living in a propaganda war, such that anything any Democrat says or anything that any Democratic aligned media outlet says or vice versa is going to be mistrusted or distrusted by the audience. And meanwhile, I think like the conditions on the ground are that there's huge bipartisan alignment among Americans about what we want in our world. Like, I think beneath all the culture wars that, again, propagandists are driving to divide us, at a bedrock level, like we all want the same stuff. We want freedom to be able to live our lives, to have the families we want. We want fairness. We want opportunity to be able to get ahead in the world. We understand and value the importance of taking on responsibility ourselves. Um, I think there's foundational values that we all share and that actually materialize in shared policy preferences. The idea, to your point, your question about one person, one vote, there's great bipartisan support for that foundational principle that is distorted and broken by a constitutional order that allows billionaires to spend freely to drive that propaganda, to divide us, to shape our politics with that level of undue influence. And so I actually do think, if we could break through the deeply problematic, entrenched issues that our two-party system provide, that a new party could actually provide a really useful vessel for that type of building of common ground, which I think we deeply need as a country. And then in terms of accountability for corruption and oligarchic abuse of power and influence over government, I think we need truth and reconciliation, right? We don't know the full extent of what Elon Musk has done. And again, I think this is a bipartisan problem. We saw, going back to the end of the Clinton presidency, we saw what seemed to be a pretty corrupt pardon to to a commodities dealer on the 11th hour of his outgoing administration. We saw very problematic pardons out of Joe Biden's presidency. We've seen these deeply corrupt pardons to the January 6th insurrectioners and Donald Trump's political donors in this first few months of this administration. We need to get to the bottom of the corrupting influence on our country and the schemes, the self-enrichment schemes that we have allowed to fester. And we need to confront it, and we need to make sure there is accountability so that when we talk about things like the rule of law, like when we talk about things like equality under the law, they aren't just empty platitudes and they actually have some meaning behind them. Because I think that's why people are checking out, right? Like we can invoke the rule of law, we can look to the facade of the Supreme Court, but when ordinary people, are doing their best, working their jobs, feeding their families, doing everything they're supposed to be doing, and they can't, even dream of ever owning a home or they're living paycheck to paycheck. Those concepts that ring as hollowly as they currently stand.
And we just talked a lot about democratic backsliding and checks and balances, separation of power, accountability, if there is such a thing. And I appreciate you bringing up the rule of law. How do we get people more engaged, or what does the public need to become more engaged on specifically so that we can return to a sense of constitutional norms?
These are big, big questions that would take us a while to unpack. I mean, first, I think it's worth pausing to consider what we are talking about when we're talking about the rule of law. There's a really wonderful primer that I would recommend to anybody, whether or not you're a lawyer or in law school or however old you are. A law professor wrote it, but it's very, very short. It's called The Rule of Law. It's by a professor at Chicago named Aziz Hook. He's absolutely brilliant. And he breaks down the history of the rule of law as a concept and how malleable it is. And I think we have to reckon with the fact that the rule of law, as we have come to accept it, is not actually serving the people, right? On some level, we were having this conversation about the rule of law in the context now of Donald Trump's defiance of judicial orders or threats to defy future judicial orders, and we can sense intuitively that it would offend or disrupt the rule of law if he were to ignore an order of the Supreme Court. So that if they say A and he does B, that's a rule of law problem. It's just as bad a rule of law problem, we argue, that the justices on the Supreme Court that are deciding the meaning of the Constitution were hand selected by billionaires and theocrats to advance a political agenda. And we have deep concerns about acceding to the normalcy of a rule of law that is decided by those six unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats. And so when we talk about the rule of law, we talk about it in terms of like it's our country, this of democracy, right? It is the people's constitution. It is a lay document. This is a document that was never intended to be inaccessible to the people or to be the exclusive domain of lawyers and judges. We talk about reading the text of the 14th Amendment and seeing that it protects birthright citizenship. And as a citizen, as a college student, as a mom, as a brother, being able to say, no, this is what the Constitution means. I don't need to wait for Sam Alito to tell me what it means, and to be empowered citizens in our country and even non-citizens, right? Everybody's got a say in how this country is going to go. And this is, I think, the critical mindset shift that we need to be making from a sort of pro-democracy legal perspective. We've been in the back seat for decades now. We don't even really realize it, but this project to remake American constitutional law and life through the courts has been underway for decades. It's only kind of reached its peak in the last few years here, where we've seen such major disruptions. But they've been running this game on us for decades, and unless we turn things around and contest their claims of legitimacy and authority to decide the rule of law, it's going to be their rule of law. And we're going to be living in what Professor Sheppel from Princeton describes as autocratic legalism. And I think that's a pretty good descriptor for actually what we're living through now. So, what the world looks like when we get through this and we rebuild, I think that's a collective project for us to engage in together. I'm excited to do it with you, Mena. because we're going to get there. We have to, right? We have to. Like, you're a generation younger than me. My kids are a generation younger than you. This world, this country needs to work for all of us. And we owe it to them as stewards to make sure that these guys don't win, that they don't take away our freedoms, that we don't have to live under their rule of law. And so that's the work. I think that's the work.
That leads kind of perfectly into the citizen engagement part and kind of the advice column we have towards the end of each podcast. And as you know, and you said, many of our listeners are still in high school or college and considering law school, but not quite there yet. What asks do you have for our listeners, and what, given your focus on these areas, is at stake for them?
Well, okay, maybe I'll just get super cheesy and transactional, and I'll say check
Please.
out our court accountability. We put out a lot of great stuff. We got the webcast YouTube show on Midas Touch Legal AF. That's a lot of fun. We'd love to have you back anytime, Mina. And then we put out great newsletter content at Tilted Scales on the constitutional politics news of the day. I got a new one out today. And then, I think the real ask though is, and the encouragement I would offer is to not feel like you can't grapple with this stuff or that other people understand it better so that you don't have a role in this conversation. Like that's how they win. And I think we've talked about this before, but for me, going through all these jobs, right? And I'm trying to like make my mom and dad proud and work at the Justice Department, and I get to the Senate and I don't know how anything works there, and everybody's always saying, "Oh, you don't know how things work." And that's your whole life, as everybody's going to tell you that you don't know how things work. And that is the key to the way this right-wing legal apparatus has weaponized the Constitution. And you don't understand this. This is doctrine. Never mind that we just made it up in a lab somewhere and are advancing it through our, politicians in robes on the bench. This is the strategy to keep the people disempowered from being the owners of our future. And so just don't let them get away with it. You might not know everything, but you know more than you think you do, and you can learn, right? And you can grapple with this stuff and ask questions and build a community and a generation that has this ownership of not just your communities and the issues that you care about, but these structural issues that are at the root of our ability to self-govern.
Well, Alex, thank you for everything you shared with us today and for everything that you're doing. It was fun having the roles reversed, asking you questions this time. I
I
appreciate
think you're better at it than I am.
it. No, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Amanda.